Good morning or good afternoon, depending when you are listening to this courageous conversation from God Before Guns. This is a series of interviews with leading gun violence prevention activists and faith leaders, not just from Northeast Ohio, where I am, but also throughout the nation. I am the Reverend Christine Eggert, and I am the co-founder and director of God Before Guns, a multi-faith coalition of individuals and faith communities working to end gun violence deaths and injuries. Today, for the interview, I welcome the Reverend Deanna Hollas, who is ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA, where she serves as the Gun Violence Prevention Ministry Coordinator with the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. Serving in this role, Reverend Hollas empowers and equips individuals and congregations across the Presbyterian Church denomination to embody Jesus' call to love God and love neighbor by being informed and active in ending gun violence. She is a founding member of the Everytown for Gun Safety Interfaith Advisory Council. We are honored to have her with us today for this conversation, and I welcome Reverend Hollas now to this conversation. Welcome. May I call you Deanna?
Yes, please.
Okay. Titles are important, but in conversation, we don't often use them, so thank you for that. Let's get started. We have a lot to cover. I will say, Deanna, that God Before Guns has had a long-standing working relationship with PC USA. Presbyterians have been involved in gun violence prevention since the 1960s, I think, and they have not let up. And so we have learned from the Presbyterians, we have collaborated with them, and we were certainly excited when they were the first denomination to call someone to a national position for gun violence prevention. You are the first person to serve in such a role. And I guess I would ask you now, share with us a little about why it is that you were interested in this position, but we're talking ministry here. So it's not just an interest, it's certainly a call. What is it in your life that you think led you to this position?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I grew up in a family of gun owners. I'm from the Panhandle part of Texas, and hunting was a regular part of my family's life. I was always around guns. So I didn't really think much about or pay much attention to what was happening to our gun laws until 2016, and Texas passed a law that allowed guns on college campuses. And my oldest daughter was a sophomore at Texas Tech at the time. And I witnessed the way her friends and roommates were reacting to the law. And it was exactly as the law was intended, and that they saw it as an invitation to buy arms, to become armed. And there was little, because I came from a family of gun owners, I realized how little they knew about guns, and what was the positions that they were taking was that all they needed was a gun, and that they were going to be able to basically become Jason Bourne. Was kind of, that this gun was automatically going to protect them and defend them, and that this was the answer to all their problems. And I knew enough to say, this is not how guns work. This is not okay. And feeling very, very helpless to really do anything. I had a friend who had just joined Moms Demand Action. So she reached out, she had reached out and said, hey, if anybody's interested. And I was like, you know what, I'm interested. So that was kind of my first introduction. Was I joined Moms Demand Action, and I started learning about how our gun laws had been dismantled in this country. I started learning about the statistics that go along with gun violence, and how many people die each year. I mean, there was so much that I didn't know. And as I began to learn that we have, close to, at that time, there was about 36,000 deaths a year. And then twice as many folks are shot and survived,
Right.
but yet wounded and life altering, you know, just the enormous impact that exists in this country. And it doesn't need to be. And that primarily the reason why it is because there's a gun industry and there's profit. So that our lawmakers have put gun industry profits before public safety.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And the numbers keep climbing. When we started this work, and I would be called to preach at churches, and I would talk about how on any given day, and I would say how many Americans were likely to be shot and killed, and every year that number has gone up. So, well, we certainly,
which is interesting, even in this year of pandemic, you know, when people might have thought that the number would have gone down, because what normally grabs people's attention is school shootings, you know, the mass shootings. And while school shootings have been practically non-existent because kids haven't been in school for so much of the year, but our numbers still went up. That it's not just the mass shootings that tend to capture all the attention. That, you know, there's suicide, there's domestic violence, there's all kinds of intentional shootings where firearms that are unsecured in homes. And now that we've been in our homes is the place where we're most at risk from a gun. Not out and about.
Certainly, doing the work here in Cleveland, we learned very quickly that though the mass shootings are what draw national attention, and it's the day in and day out violence and certainly the pandemic has not helped that, with people feeling isolated or in domestic violence situations. Well, you began your work, I believe, maybe just not quite a year before the pandemic hit. So I guess we would be interested in knowing what your work looks like. What's a typical day like for you? Maybe both, you know, pre and post pandemic. Do congregations get in touch with you? Individuals? What sort of work are you doing in this role?
Yeah, all of the above. So the role is, you know, ministry coordinator, gun violence prevention ministry coordinator. And so we have a toolkit, so folks can download our toolkit, which is resources for people to have. And so then we have those individuals that oftentimes, you know, have downloaded the toolkit, but then we also have congregations, in the sense that before the pandemic hit, I would have individuals within congregations. So it may be like a social justice committee. I've had pastors reach out to me. And so I was doing a lot of traveling, in which I was going around and preaching and teaching on, you know, educating folks on the issues, and then also helping them find ways to take action, ways that they can connect and become involved. And then when the pandemic hit, quite honestly, you know, there wasn't a real interest in gun violence prevention at that time. People were just trying to figure out, you know, how do we get on Zoom? How do we find toilet paper? What's going to happen next, right?
More immediate issues for people, yes.
Yes, and then came the killing of George Floyd, and that shifted our work within the Peace Fellowship, which is the organization that I work for, is the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. And so that shifted our work. And we saw it as a time to really just kind of pause all the work that we were doing and to really begin to do a deep dive, studying about abolition, studying about police violence, studying about racial inequities. And so we're not quite sure how our work is going to look going forward, but we know it's going to be different. We know that we're going to have to rethink maybe some of the ways that we look at gun violence prevention, so that we're more inclusive with making sure that we're talking about issues that impact races and differently, and women differently, to really center those in the work that we do, the concerns of women and the concerns of folks of other races. And in particular, we have just endorsed a policy that it was spearheaded by an organization called Not My Generation. And they gathered a bunch of youth-led gun violence prevention organizations. So like Youth Over Guns, March for Our Lives, California, Team Enough. And they put together a policy that's called Depolicing the Gun Violence Prevention Movement. And it's a real, interesting look that oftentimes gun violence prevention might say, no guns in your church, unless it's a security guard. So oftentimes the gun violence prevention movement was relying on police for enforcement. And so this is really listening to voices that do not feel that the police make them safe. And how might that impact and influence the way that we do gun violence prevention? I don't have those answers right now. Like, we're still exploring. I do know that even before the pandemic, we had put forward an overture with our denomination to be able to, we'd already felt this call and this need to relook at our gun violence prevention policy. The current policy that we have is over 10 years old. And it really does center white voices. So to be able to relook at that policy and to see, how is this, how can we better consider the needs of communities of color and women.
Right, because gun violence victims are disproportionately people of color. So that's important work. And 2020 has been such a difficult year, but it's also been a year when we were, because we weren't traveling as much and weren't meeting in person as much, that we could pull back a little and begin evaluating some of what we've published and the work that we're doing. So we'll certainly look forward to seeing the new work that comes from those efforts. The Presbyterian Peace Fellowship is certainly a good resource for us and for many others. And when we conclude this interview, we'll make sure that those websites are on the screen so people can refer to those.
Thank you.
One of the issues that we were studying and talking to people about right before the pandemic, was the issue of security in churches. Certainly the Charleston shooting at Mother Emanuel had impact. We hosted Reverend Sharon Risher, whose mother and other family members died in that shooting. And so we were already looking at that work. But then, of course, when Tree of Life happened in Pittsburgh, that was another time to renew talking about that. And we were finding that people were finding it difficult to have the conversation about security in churches in a way that felt true to their values as people of faith. For us, that would be true to our gospel values. And certainly churches are all over the place, and whether they want parishioners to be armed or to have security or whatever. But it was a conversation before our churches were shuttered for a year, but I know it's a conversation that's going to to come up again, and probably has been ongoing during this time that we've been away from the buildings. How have you been, you've touched on it a little, how have you been involved in that issue?
Yeah, and that is an issue that people often want me to talk about when I come, and I always say I'm not in the church security business. That's not something that I do or that I understand. But truly, the best way for us to be safe is to love and care for our neighbors and to take action. So I'm really here to empower folks to take action in order to find their safety there. That, you know, getting laws passed that limit access to who can obtain a weapon, you know, building community. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Shane Claiborne and Raw Tools.
Yes.
But I think this notion of swords to plowshare is really a role for churches to get in.
Yes.
And when you think about, you know, my background before going into ministry was I was an accountant. So the first thing that I look at is I was like, you know, a gun is a non-consumable product, that it's not like even a car in which you can drive it for 20 years, but eventually you're going to have to replace it. Guns are not replaced. I mean, they don't have necessarily a shelf life in the sense that, you know, a lot of people aren't using them on a regular basis, so their firing, you know, usage is low. But the one that my husband owns, it's a 1903 Springfield, and it still works, you know, so he doesn't need to get another gun. Well, if you're in the gun manufacturing business, that's a problem. You know, you need to have revenue. And so that's a lot of what's behind this issue that we have. And so what we can begin to do, I think, as churches, just to be able to offer people a place to dispose of unwanted weapons that doesn't require they be returned to the marketplace. And we can put ceremony around that, because maybe some of these guns are ones that have been used in suicides. And so there's some healing that may need to happen. I'll inherit quite a few guns from my father. So that was part of who he was, you know, that was his identity. So to be able to have some ceremony around how they are disposed of is a service I think churches can provide. And then to transform that weapon into feeding people, because what could be more important, as we realize this year, that we, you know, toilet paper and food, those are pretty much our top priorities.
But in many locations, gun stores were listed as essential businesses. So it definitely an issue, pandemic or not. You mentioned the Reverend Shane Claiborne, and God Before Guns hosted Shane here in Cleveland at a local UCC church, where we melted down an AR-15, the same model that was used in the Newtown shootings. And it was a weapon that my husband bought in a parking lot after seeing it online. My husband, who certainly would have passed a background check, but did not have a background check to buy that weapon. And then we melted that weapon down. But it showed us in a very close-up way how easy it is to buy a gun, and a gun that could have been used in a very different way. And I highly recommend Shane's book about gun violence. He's certainly a good Christian authority on the issue. We also worked, a mentor of ours was Reverend Jim Atwood, who was a Presbyterian pastor, longtime, I think, board member of the Peace Fellowship, who was a pastor in Virginia, who was also a gun owner and a hunter and a member of the NRA for years, but also an activist in gun violence prevention for decades. And I remember the last time that we hosted Reverend Atwood here in Cleveland, he shared the story of deciding to give up his guns because he was over 80 years old at the time, and just felt like being around guns was not as safe for him as it had been in the past. A tough decision for a lifelong gun owner to make, but he also, knew what guns could do, and I thought that was a fine example of another way we might be addressing the issue in our churches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, we know, because we're doing this work, and I say we for the two of us and the organizations that we represent and all the people that we come across in our work, we know that gun violence prevention work is multi-layered. There's no simple answer. I don't know about you. We certainly have run across the question in our years of doing this work of, why isn't there just one gun violence prevention organization? Wouldn't you be better off if you just had one organization and united around that organization? And I don't know what that would be or what that would look like. And certainly all the groups that we have worked with, they all add something to the effort. Tell us a little bit about who you work with and how that collaboration works.
Well, my most prominent is with Moms Demand Action in every town, and that's just because that was where I grew up, right? Like that was
right.
The folks that I know and the connection I have. So it's predominantly them, and I rely on them to be able to help congregations, particularly when it comes to activism with or advocacy and dealing with laws. I don't have the resources myself to be able to learn all the different laws, and so it's nice to have local folks on the ground to particularly deal with state issues. That is where a lot of the really dangerous gun laws happen, are actually at the state level here in Texas.
Indeed.
Every year, Texas used to have some of the strongest gun laws in the country, because there was a time when we understood that gun ownership and responsibility went hand in hand, and that meant responsible gun laws. But like I said, the NRA, funded by gun manufacturers, have spent quite a few years dismantling our gun laws. And so one of the ones that we're up against this year in Texas is permitless carry, to be able to allow anybody to have a gun, to be able to drop. We have the age limit of 21. That could drop to 18. To not be able to have any type of training, I shudder when I think about my own daughter and what it would have been like if those friends and roommates of hers would have been able to have that easy of an access to a weapon. How many times they would have made bad decisions. I know right after this, it was late at one night, and there was a roommate that they thought was still out, ended up being home. And if they would have had a gun in there was a knock on the door, they were terrified. And it was because somebody had shown up to meet the roommate. It was 1 o'clock at night. College kids, right? Like you knock on the doors. And just the amount of terror that my daughter was feeling by having a stranger at the door, having now footprints in the house that she didn't know was there.
Yes.
If she would have thought that a gun was the only option that she had for her safety,
right, and
had easy access to one,
yes,
that could have been a really damaging situation.
Absolutely.
We have to be able to have different options, to have different conversations, to understand that guns do not keep us safe.
Tell us a little bit about the is it the Everytown Interfaith Council that you serve on? Describe that a little to us.
Yeah, so we just formed in the past couple months, actually. And so it's made up of different faith leaders across the country. And at this time, we have been gathering in order to decide what is our role, what do we have to offer in this conversation, and how can we as faith leaders, best shift the needle. And there's the understanding, you know, that laws are necessary, but this is also a moral problem.
Absolutely.
You know, the morality of our country is at stake here. And so what is the role of faith leaders to be able to address that, and to be able, I think, to you know, again, to remind folks what does keep us safe, and it's building community. You know, and a reminder that we're up against these powerful economic forces, that is really what's driving the situation that we're in. It's not about loving and caring for one another. And that was the message that Jesus had for us. You know, Jesus
Absolutely. said. It is a sanctity of life issue. And we believe people of faith, all faiths, should be using their voices and their voting power and all the ways that we can as citizens to make our faith of, for us, it's following Jesus, but to make our faith and our values known. And we just, we cannot allow ourselves to allow this country to be a place in which we are armed against each other. And sadly, we see far too much of that. Laws are so important. And here in Ohio, they're going what we consider the wrong direction, as you mentioned, in Texas. And certainly in the most recent mass shooting that we're aware of in Atlanta, the gunman bought the gun just hours before the shooting. And you just wonder what some hours or days of waiting to be able to own the gun might have made a difference. And certainly it's very discouraging for many of us who live in states where we feel like we're just fighting bad legislation all the time. But it looks like there might be some light on the national scene. I am sure you have read with interest about the House of Representatives passing the two bills recently, one for expanded background checks and the other to close the Charleston loophole with waiting time on guns. Have you been involved in that? Have you been calling your Congress people and urging others to do that?
You know, I'll confess, it's a hard call for me because Ted Cruz is my senator, and
True.
You know, that's a heavy lift. That's
Yes.
a heavy lift when it comes to making calls.
Yes.
But you know, in really advocacy is not as effective as it used to be. In that, really, what it's about is voting and getting, you know, the right people in office. And while advocacy is still important, but again, someone like Ted Cruz, you know, I don't know that that's ever going to be effective. But you know, it's such this is the result of a lot of people doing a lot of hard work, that these bills got passed in the House.
Yes.
And it didn't just, you know, when I got involved in 2016, one of the first people that I had a meeting with was this representative. He was a congressional representative for the District of El Paso, Texas, and had this funny name. I'd never heard of him. And he wanted to talk to folks about gun laws. He wanted to know if a candidate had ever run for office in the state of Texas and won on a platform of gun violence prevention. Yeah. And, you know, in 2016, I sat around and again, I was a newbie. And so there were some moms who had been at this for longer than me. And they said, well, you know, it's pretty tough and somebody's tried, but they didn't win. And, you know, but this is new. This is new for Texas. Right. He didn't even have a platform. He'd been elected to the U.S. Congress twice and didn't even have a platform for gun violence prevention.
Yes.
Can you imagine what his name is?
I think I can guess, but why don't you share with our listeners?
Beto O'Rourke.
Absolutely.
You know, somebody who went on to run for president
Yes.
strictly on a campaign of gun violence prevention,
Right.
you know, and had one of the most famous lines of all time that says, you know, hell yeah, I'm going to take your gun away. So there is reason to be hopeful. That was a big shift in a really short amount of time. And I think that's what we have to remember, because I am, you know, I get the discouragement of having to make these calls and feel like you're not getting anywhere, and losing some really important elections. But the House to pass these laws, it's working. It's working.
Yes, and we need to move on to the Senate, and it's difficult to be encouraged yet, but a lot can happen. So we'll see where those bills go. We do know over the years since we started doing this work, early on we were involved with a documentary film about background checks. The title of it was 91%, which was at the time the percentage of Americans who favored expanded background checks, and I don't think that percentage has gone down over the years. It's what the American people want, and so it's certainly up to us to stay on the issue to see that these laws can be passed. You've touched on this in a few ways during our time together. It can be discouraging to do this work for many reasons. We follow the money, and we see why the gun industry is so powerful. We sort of beat our heads against the wall sometimes in the states we live in about laws, but we do keep doing this work, and we keep coming back. What is it that encourages you? What keeps you doing this important work?
You know, I always say I got involved in gun violence prevention for my own child, but I stay in this work for other people's children.
Yes.
Every time I talk to a survivor, every time I talk to a mother who's lost, you know, whose child has been taken from her by gun violence, it's for the children. That's why I do it, because not one more, you know. This is just senseless. This is unnecessary. We don't have to live like this. And, you know, I'm tired of it. And so there's not another choice for me, right? There's not another choice. It's either, you know, like I can't give up. Even when I want to give up, every night I hear the gunfire at my home every single night. I live in the city and I hear the gunfire every single night.
We certainly know that we know the story of Jesus, when Jesus, against his disciples' advice, held a child in his arms. And that child was not Jesus' son or daughter. The child may not have been the son or daughter of the disciples who were gathered around him. It didn't matter. He or she was a child. And because Jesus lifted the importance of children to us, all children, not just our own, you're right. We as faith leaders need to stay in this until we can really see that we have made a difference. And I know that you are making a difference and will continue to do that. It's still early in this work that you're doing, and we wish you all the best, and we hope that you will come back and talk to us again. And we still look forward to an opportunity when you can make one of those trips here to Cleveland, and we can be doing this work with a group of people who are active and involved and wanting to know more about what we can do as people of faith. So do you have any last words, any last statement that you'd like to leave with us?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to be able to talk about this important work of ending gun violence. And I just encourage everybody to take action.
Okay.
You know, whatever that may be, no matter how small, do it at your comfort level, you know, and do it with others. Find others. That's why I you know, Moms to Me in Action, you know, was important to me because it gave me support people. So find others in your congregation, find others in your community, gather with your neighbors, and just begin to build community, because we keep each other safe.
We do. We do. We remind each other of the importance of loving those beyond our immediate circle of family and friends. So thank you so much, Reverend Hollas, for joining us today. We look forward to putting this interview out there so many more people can see it. Thank you, and God's blessings on your work.
Yes, you too.